Welcome to the panel on the U.S. elections and the world, but especially the Baltics. I'm David Andelman. I'm a columnist for USA Today and CNN.com, and I'm also the U.S. political commentator for France 24 television. Overnight, there's been some dramatic changes in Washington, in America, as to the dynamics of this election. 24 hours ago or 36 hours ago, we would have said that it was really pretty much a one-sided event at that point, a very narrow path for Donald Trump for victory, a very broad highway for Hillary Clinton. But this all changed when the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, reopened the investigation apparently into Secretary of State Clinton's emails, her email servers. They found apparently a trove of new emails on a laptop that was owned by the husband, or the soon-to-be ex-husband, of Huma Abedin, one of Hillary Clinton's top aides. There are thousands of emails apparently on this laptop, which may have come through Hillary Clinton's servers from the State Department. The FBI has now sent a letter to Congress suggesting that they are now going to be looking at each of these, and certainly they will not have a chance to go through all millions or thousands of them before the elections 10 days from now. So the whole tenor of the campaign has changed. Suddenly, Donald Trump has a new energy. He has said Hillary Clinton has clearly committed a not only fraud, but a criminal act, and this is how we are going forward. Hillary Clinton has demanded a full explanation from the FBI and an understanding of where we stand 10 days before the election. A virtually unprecedented action in American political history. That is to say, an action like this by an investigative body on one of the two principal candidates for presidency 10 days before the election. So I have here two of our consummate experts on the American political scene. We're delighted to have them with us. Perhaps they could introduce themselves one by one, and then after that we'll have a brief comment from each of them about where we stand.
Well, my name is Robert Nerak. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Before that, I've spent quite a bit of time at the RAND Corporation, doing work there, and then quite a number of years in Moscow as director of the Carnegie Center there. And so that sort of defines the areas where I work on, which are former Soviet Union, Russia, Western relations, security policy.
My name is James Davis. I'm the Dean of the School of Economics and Political Science at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. I'm an American political scientist who's spent about 20 years of his career in Europe and spent a lot of time trying to explain American politics and foreign policy to European audiences. And
perhaps more difficult this year than ever in the past.
It is. In particular, trying to explain how it is that somebody who's never had any political or foreign policy experience becomes the nominee of one of our great political parties.
How do you explain it? Let's start off with that.
Yeah, how do I explain it? I mean, I think it's clear that the American electorate is angry, or at least a significant sector of the American electorate is angry. In Donald Trump, they found a person who, in an unorthodox way, seems to express that anger, and somebody who's seen by many as interesting because he's not part of that system, and they hope that he can shake it up. Many of us have our doubts about that, but I think that's what's driving this.
Do you share that? And also, what I'd like to have you, from your background, go a little bit further and suggest what the impact not only of a Donald Trump presidency, which still seems somewhat less likely, but the fallout from all of the rhetoric during this campaign might have on the Baltic states and their relations with Russia.
Yeah. Well, let me start with two broad observations. One is that Russian behavior, activities, and rhetoric in and around Ukraine since 2014 has really had a dramatic impact on the policy community in Washington, both the government and the broader policy community, and that's not going to go away. I mean, people, I think, generally have agreed that the problem with the relationship with Russia and Russia's activities in and around the Baltic states is not, as commonly said, it's not a temporary storm. This is something we'll be dealing with for a while. The other side of the coin, though, is that the U.S. has a global agenda. And many items on that agenda are very neuralgic in American politics, both starting with the Middle East, but also Asia. So any government, any new administration will be balancing these things. The U.S. is going to be, I think, committed to and engaged in the Baltics for some time. But at the margins, it's going to be making decisions about where its political capital and financial capital goes, and some of those marginal decisions can matter. So I think myself that there will be a difference there at these important margins depending on who wins. Hillary, I think, is someone whose instincts are to stay engaged. Indeed, in some areas, I think she and people who are associated with her will. Their instincts will be to be more engaged, more active in this part of the world. But she will also have these constraints I mentioned. Donald Trump is much more unpredictable. We can come back to him in a moment.
Well, let's focus briefly on Donald Trump. He has suggested that no NATO country could necessarily count on American backing if it hadn't, in fact, invested 2% of its GDP in its military force. Only one of the Baltic countries has really reached that level so far, and that's Estonia. The other two are still have projects to get there, but are not yet gotten there. How concerned are you that this will encourage that, plus the obvious tilt of Trump towards Putin? How much do you think that might encourage some kind of adventure, if you will, on the part of Putin?
Well, I mean, I think none of us really know what the foreign policy philosophy of Donald Trump is. He seems to have a kind of a transactional approach to our alliances. You could almost suggest the USA is for hire. If you want to have some protection, pay up. I don't think that's an approach that would last very long if Donald Trump were to become president. I think it is an approach that makes a lot of our allies worried. I think it is an approach that some people in Moscow are happy to hear. But I don't think it would last very long. I don't think it would last long because the majority of the Republican Party, I think, still is committed to a traditional understanding of America's interests in the world and understands that our alliances are there primarily because they serve our interests, not because we're doing anybody any favors with those alliances. But I do agree with Robert that there is probably a difference in the sense that Donald Trump seems to want to withdraw, and Hillary Clinton, her first instinct is to engage even more. And I think you would see with a Trump administration, at least in the beginning, some confusion on the part of our allies as they try to find out what precisely all of this means.
Well, withdraw, yes, from some parts of the world, but engage with Putin. Is that necessarily all bad? We will go back to the early years of the Obama administration when the reset was in force. That obviously didn't work, but is there any way that a more, shall we say, friendly president could interact more effectively and engage with Putin to try to prevent his adventures?
Well, I think this is going to be an issue for either one of them because as I mentioned before, on the one hand, there really is a very big difference now in what people expect from, hope for, what people think is feasible or desirable with respect to relations with Russia. But this does not mean pure isolation. I mean, even now, there are parts of the agenda which the administration has tried to fence off from the broader deterioration. It's a fairly narrow and well-defined one, but not a trivial one. It's mostly nuclear arms control and nonproliferation. Parts of that are even under some strain. But they have tried to do it, and there are other areas where the policy community is thinking about areas where it would be useful to have at least Russian acquiescence, if not help. And so there will be a question of re-engaging on particular issues will be arising. And it'll be interesting to see what happened. I was glad that Jim talked about transactionalism because this is very much a Russian instinct. When we do this, I mean, people may use the famous phrase about engaging with Russia on areas of common interests. I think what we'll see, even when it looks like in broad terms that there is a shared interest on some issue, will find that priorities are different and that the Russian transactionalism will come into play. They'll say, yes, but of course, but how about something else? They'll be linking it to other issues. We do this too. It's not unknown. But it won't be an uncomplicated set of discussions, I think.
Jim, I was very interested in your idea of transactionalism, which Robert rightly pointed out. My old Harvard professor, Henry Kissinger, used to have this concept of Weltanschauung, a worldview. And he said the greatest presidents in international affairs are those who came in with a real Weltanschauung, a worldview, the way they would like to see the world when they left office. Reagan had one, certainly his worldview was an end to communism in the Soviet Union, and it happened. Nixon had one, opening to China and bringing China into the world and so on. Lately, presidents don't seem to have had that kind of a Weltanschauung, or at least been able to, and they sort of ping-pong from one crisis to another. How important, first of all, I'm assuming that you do not see Donald Trump as bringing any kind of a Weltanschauung to the presidency, but how about Hillary Clinton?
Well, first of all, I think it's probably a function of the fact that we didn't seem to have a Weltanschauung in the past that leads us to want one now, because we see that without some kind of a unifying, a set of unifying principles, it's difficult to move an agenda forward. And I think as we see the world fraying at the edges, or perhaps the seams coming apart, whether we're talking about the Middle East, whether we're talking about Asia, whether we're talking about Europe, I think the Clinton administration, or the future Clinton administration, if we have one, will be committed to putting that back together. I think from all we can see, Hillary Clinton has a view of the world that is based on a liberal order governed by rules and norms to which everybody signs up. And I think you see it in her speeches, you see it in her foreign policy pronouncements. She's interested in finding out a way to put that order back on a solid basis, and to expand the participation in that order, to get new countries involved in that. And I think the approach toward Russia, since we're talking about Russia, would be precisely along those bases. Reassert the importance of a liberal world order, and trying to convince the Russians to play by that game. Now, I don't think that's going to be an easy thing to do. I don't think it's going to be easy to do that on a transactional basis either, because I think that the actual foundations of contemporary Russian foreign policy are found in the domestic politics of the Russian Federation, and not in something that we're doing abroad. And so, since I don't buy the narrative that Putin's foreign policy is a response to what we've been doing, I find it very hard to believe that an approach that tries to bring him in based on things that we're doing is going to be very fruitful.
Robert, I spent about an hour, a little over a month ago, with Poroshenko of Ukraine in New York, and he said that the next crisis that the U.S. and NATO will have to respond to by the Russians is in the Baltics, and he said that's Russia's next target. And I've just spent a couple of weeks traveling through the Baltics. I began in Tallinn and Estonia, then in Vilnius and Lithuania, now here. And my sense throughout is they share a similar fear that the Russians will start to try to push more and more in this part of the world. And there's some evidence of that. The Iskander missiles that came in Kaliningrad, the sea forces in the Baltic, the Russian overflights and so on in that part of the world, they're pushing the envelope. They also, though, see that while they really are determined to have a self-defense and defend themselves at all costs, they need the U.S. behind them, absolutely. And they point back to the time around 1948 to 53, when they kept expecting the U.S. to come in and help them when the Russians were taking over their country. They say they can't imagine us doing that again. So what is your feeling about the Russians, the inevitability of some kind of a Russian adventure, and the prospects that the U.S. really will, in fact, come in to do its best to prevent that?
Well, let me respond to the second question first, because it bears on the first. I have no doubts about what the U.S. would do. The U.S. Is committed to Baltic defense.
Even under a Trump presidency?
I think, I mean, I hate to predict what Trump would do, but I think, you know, the weight of U.S. commitments and of the policy community generally would make it very difficult for him. I think, frankly, if there were an invasion, you know, an outright invasion of the Baltic states, and he did not respond, he'd probably get impeached. And people would tell him that. So anyway, we'll see. I mean, this gets to the first question. I've been involved in Baltic security issues for a long time, and as a result, I've been asked a lot by Balts and others the question, what do you think is the likelihood of a Russian invasion? And my answer has been, if by that you mean a pre-planned invasion, that there's someone sitting, a planner in the bowels of the Kremlin waiting for the right opportunity, I think the chances are very low.
Oh, no, I mean, 2 divisions, 3 divisions coming across the, is unlikely.
Well, but what I would say is the following. I think, A, it's important that NATO does not plan on the basis of that assumption, because it could be wrong. But secondly, and this is the main point, even if I'm not wrong, there's something else that I worry about more, which I think is not likely but less implausible, and that's basically a crisis gone bad.
A crisis?
A crisis in the region gone bad. And what I mean by that is that it's an extension of the kinds of activities we're seeing already, very provocative behavior in and around the borders. There's an accident, and that escalates, and it could have the same result. It may not be wouldn't be the result of a plan, because real military action against NATO would be a huge gamble by Russia, even though their local, you know, balance of forces in the short term would be very much to their advantage. But strategically, it would be a huge gamble. So I think the odds against it are high. But it's important to keep them as high as possible. And secondly, therefore, I think one of the things that really needs to be done is to work out some rules of the road in and around the borders to try to manage and deflate the possibility of these kinds of accidents, crises getting out of control.
Jim, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I tend to think a direct invasion is not in the cards, but I fear more the sorts of activities we've seen in Germany. We've probably seen in the United States with the emails being delivered to WikiLeaks. I fear more involvement of Russian agents or Russian interests in the domestic politics of the states of Europe.
Hybrid warfare,
and
asymmetric.
hybrid warfare being a more extreme version, but just efforts to manipulate public opinion through strategically planting stories, manipulating social media, purchasing spokespersons amongst former government officials or former media officials, and that's the sort of thing that I fear more. And given that there are large minority Russian-speaking populations in the Baltics, those would be a likely target for this type of manipulation. To what extent that is a successful strategy, I don't know, but that would be the sort of strategy I would fear. And I think that we need to be better prepared to meet these types of challenges when they emerge.
Robert?
No, I mean, I very much agree with that. That I think is a much more serious and chronic problem. It's one that's getting a lot more attention now, which is not to say we know necessarily what to do about all of it, but it's something that's very much on the agenda. The only qualification I'd add to this is that I think that the fact that there are Russian populations here in Latvia and Estonia has been given too much emphasis as a problem that it deserves. It's not that there's no vulnerabilities there, but I've been trying to spend a lot of time actually talking to people in these populations. I'll give you a very quick anecdote. I was in Narva, which is in northeastern Estonia, this summer talking to people in this community, and they had some complaints about the government, particularly the so-called gray passports, which are still there, but they had 2 real resentments. The first was that they're not loyal Estonian citizens. The second is that they're easily manipulated by the Kremlin, that they're putty in the hands of the Kremlin. Both of these things really annoyed them. Now, and I think this is probably true, there are generational differences clearly, but especially of the younger generations that have grown up in Latvia and Estonia, I think this is true. Of the very large majority of the population. The only problem is that there may be very few exceptions, it may be only 2%, but it wouldn't take very many people to cause trouble, enough trouble to provide a pretext to the Kremlin if they're looking for one. So it's not an issue that I would dismiss by any means, but I think it's important to understand what the nature of it is.
We just had heard one of the Deputy Assistant Secretaries of Defense in the main panel here in Riga, the Riga conference, suggests that really 2% of GDP committed to military, which is the threshold, and which is the threshold that basically NATO has agreed upon, and which Trump is now insisting on, of course, is the minimum. That the U.S. is pretty close to 4% now, and other NATO nations need to go surpass that. How critical do you think that is in terms of U.S. commitment to? They have to show that they have as he put it, skin in the game.
Well, the question of burden sharing is long-standing. The United States has been asking the Europeans to shoulder more of the burden of collective defense for a long time. Is that getting through? It gets through. Is that the sine qua non of American support for Europe? I don't think so. That said, 2% seems like a reasonable target, especially 2% if we have growing economies. We don't want to reach 2% the way the Greeks have, which is by having a collapse of GDP. And then, of course, it's about investing 2% wisely. There are a lot of ways to have more efficient use of resources and create much more firepower. We could go through a number of European countries and probably get a lot more punch even without reaching 2%.
Well, it's interesting. A couple of Lithuanians have told me, one government official, one senior journalist, who said, look, we're used to retreating to the Maquis if we have to. We did it for 5 years when we were waiting for the Americans back in 48 to 53. And we can do that again if the Russians came in. They would find themselves in another quagmire, and they don't want another Afghanistan. And they would find themselves in another Afghanistan in the Baltics. So is that a mentality that you think the next American administration should encourage, to demonstrate to the Russians? This would not be a good place for an adventure, if you will. That this could really be much worse for you in many ways even than Ukraine or Georgia.
Well, I think it's not only something that they will do, it's something they are starting to do now. It's one of the products, really, of the decisions taken at the recent Warsaw Summit of NATO, because there are two parts of it. One, a lot of what was done, what was decided, has to do with so-called foreign presence in the region and the beginnings of strategies for reinforcement. But what everybody understands is, because of the local force ratios, that the more that Russia, if Russia were to invade, the harder we could make it, the more we could delay them, the more costs we could incur, the better, both directly and as a matter of deterrence. And therefore, one of the areas of focus now will be to try to support local governments in local forces, and this is National Guards. It's all the things, all the capabilities that they would need to make
home defense,
to make things difficult for an invading Russian force. They can't beat them, but they can incur costs, and that by itself is a deterrent.
We have about 2 minutes left, so let's give each of you a chance to sort of present your vision of the future. Either a Trump or a Clinton administration and its relations to this part of the world.
Well, my vision of the future is a U.S.-led liberal order that's supported by sufficient deterrent and defense capabilities to make us all rest easy at night.
That's your hope.
That's
your
my
dream.
vision. That's my vision. Yeah. And I think it's achievable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Robert?
Well, I mean, my vision is that we will sustain this in the countries that have it now, and the hard question will be to expand it. And that's one of the reasons why I talked about these trade-offs that any administration will make, where its political energy will go, where its political capital will go, where its financial capital will go. I think there'll still be some of it. I went to the Eastern Partnerships nations, for example. I'm less optimistic than I'd like to be that it's going to show a lot of results in the near term, but I certainly don't give up for the medium and long term.
Good. Well, I hope that neither of us will have reason to give up, and I want to thank both of our distinguished panelists here, and do stay tuned. There'll be lots more in the next 10 days ahead as we see who the next leadership of the United States will be. I'm David Andelman, and thanks for being with us.